Very good evening. Welcome to the India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. Now, will GST rates have to be increased to make up for a shortfall in revenues and delayed compensations to state governments? That's the big question as state finance ministers have met Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman once again today, complaining against delayed payments of compensation since August. Now, while GST revenues increased to over 1 lakh crore rupees in November, the record so far indicates we may see a shortfall for this full year. State finance ministers spoke out about their concerns after meeting with the finance minister today.
पर यहाँ आना ये हमारे लिए भी एक किस्म की जिल्लत तो नहीं कहूँगा, बट शर्मिंदगी तो है कि पैसे मांगने आ गए हैं। और जो बंदा पैसे मांगने आता है तो कई बार फिर उसको सीरियसली भी नहीं लिया जाता। तो मुझे इस बात की तो खुशी है कि उन्होंने बड़े सब्र और अदब से हमारी बात सुनी। यूनियन एफएम ने उन्होंने कोई टाइमलाइन तो नहीं दिया कि कब रिलीज़ करेंगे, बट उन्होंने अपना फ़िक्र ज़रूर जाहिर किया और उन्होंने ये भी हमें विश्वास दिलाया कि वो अपनी ज़िम्मेवारी से भाग नहीं रहे हैं। आप इसका मतलब ये ना निकालिएगा कि ये ज़िम्मेवारी नहीं है। एंड उन्होंने हमें इस बात क्या भरोसा, तसल्ली, एतबार दिलाया कि जल्द से जल्द, जितनी जल्दी हो सकता है, जितना मुमकिन है और जितनी उनकी हैसियत और औकात है, उतनी जल्दी ये कॉम्पनसेशन जो है स्टेट्स को रिलीज़ कर दी जाएगी।
पिछले 2 महीने से कॉम्पनसेशन का पूरा पैसा सभी राज्यों का रोक के रखा गया है। किस लिए रोक के रखा गया है, यूनियन फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर ने उस बारे में कोई बात नहीं रखी। हमने पूछा तो उन्होंने कहा हम सही समय आने पे बताएंगे। ऐसा नहीं है कि पैसा नहीं है। सेस के तहत करीब 50,000 करोड़ रुपए इकट्ठा होकर रखा हुआ है जब गोवा में कॉन्फ्रेंस हुई थी। और ये सिर्फ ऐसा नहीं है कि नॉन बीजेपी राज्यों की बात है, हर एक राज्य इससे जूझ रहा है। किसी भी राज्य के लिए 1,000-2,000 करोड़ रुपए, 4,000 करोड़ रुपए पर महीने का नीचे जाना, उसका फंड्स अवेलेबल होना, तनख्वाहों के लाले पड़े हुए हैं, स्कूल अस्पतालों में, बिजली पानी में, लोगों की जो रोज़ाना की ज़िंदगी है उसके लाले पड़े हुए हैं।
3 दिन बाद 2 महीने का और हो जाएगा तो लगभग 3,000 करोड़ जो है मध्य प्रदेश की ये राशि हो जाएगी। ये पैसा न जाने से, मैं आपसे पहले ही कहा कि जो मध्य प्रदेश के अपने फंड्स हैं वो हमें अत्यधिक बारिश की वजह से वहाँ लोगों को मदद करना पड़ रही है। जो गरीब आदमियों के हित की योजनाएं चलती हैं, चाहे वो वृद्धावस्था पेंशन हो, निराश्रित पेंशन हो, बुजुर्गों की पेंशन हो या और आम आदमी के संबंधित जो योजनाएं हैं, जो विकास के जो हमारे काम हैं, उस पर रुकावट आती है। इसीलिए मैं बार बार कह रहा हूं कि ये जो पैसे की हम बात कर रहे हैं, ये हम भीख मांगने के हिसाब से बात नहीं कर रहे हैं। ये हमारा अधिकार है, कानून के तहत हमारा हक बनता है।
Well, so the big question is, will GST rates have to be increased to make up for a shortfall in revenues and delayed compensations to state government? That's really what everyone is wondering. And to speak more on that, I'm joined today by Maithili Bhusrumat, consulting editor at ET Now. I'm also joined by Najib Shah, former chairman of CBEC, and Pratik Jain, leader of indirect tax at PwC. Welcome to all of you and thank you so much for speaking with us today. Now, we're talking about this, assuming that on December 18th, the question of whether rates should be increased will come up. There are reliable reports that say that states will look at this option as well. Maithili, considering right now you already have a squeeze in demand, would that even work? Should that even be considered?
Well, it is a very tough call because the fact is that the union government is facing a tremendous squeeze on its revenues. It has seen both direct as well as indirect tax revenues to date fall dramatically short of what the budget estimates were. So given the fact that the centre is also very keen on observing its fiscal deficit target, of course there is likely to be some kind of a breach, but they would like to minimize that breach. So given this and also the promise to the states that they will compensate them for any loss in revenues that does not grow, any growth in revenue less than 14%. That was a commitment that the union government gave to the states at the time of implementing the GST in order to get them on board. So having made this promise and faced with a squeeze on their revenues, the centre has very few options. Unfortunately, when it comes to GST, as far as the centre is concerned, unfortunately from the centre's perspective, it needs the GST council's buy-in, which means all the state finance ministers also have to agree. So we'll have to wait and see whether state governments are also on board to increase the GST, particularly on those sin goods, as it were, sin taxes, luxury items. It will be a tough call, but my sense is that given the kind of elasticity of demand for these goods, a slight increase in GST in the compensation cess for these items may not really hurt consumption very much. So if the GST Council agrees, that could be a possible option.
How do you look at this question, Pratik? Because there is a school of thought which is actually saying that reduce GST rates. Reduce rates right now, bring it down to, the 12% that the Kelkar committee had originally proposed, add a, merit, demerit sort of slab and leave it at that and hope that consumption will pick up and that will propel growth.
Yeah, I mean, my view is that there should not be any change at all right now on rate of tax. It can't be reduced now because of the revenue shortfall, but it should certainly not be increased as well. A couple of points I'd like to make. One is that, look, the major GST rate cuts happened in November 2017 and then January and then followed by July, where many of the items from 28% bracket was reduced to 18%. But there is absolute no correlation that we saw between the rate reduction and revenue collection, because revenue collection went higher, in the month of April 19, for example, after the rate cuts as well, it was high, right? So usually indirect tax does not have that correlation. And in fact, there is a reverse correlation that if you increase the tax rate, typically in many cases, the tax collection is lower because either the demand slows down, or you have this problem of smuggling and people start dealing in cash. So today's economic scenario, and also given the fact that GST itself is there are so many challenges happening on the new return framework is coming, e-invoicing is in the store, and the businesses are right now struggling a bit with all of these challenges. This is not the right time to increase the tax rates. As far as compensation cess is concerned, when Maithili mentioned, there are 2-3 sectors like automobile, aerated beverages and tobacco. And I don't think any of these sectors today can take a hike. I mean, auto sector is slowing down a bit. And, in tobacco, you have a very peculiar problem because, a large amount of the sector is outside the tax net. And historically, when you increase the tax rate, you have not gathered that kind of additional revenues. So I don't think it's the right time to make any changes in the structure. The government is doing some right kind of things by simplifying the compliances, using technology to go after the tax evaders. They should continue their efforts. As the economy revives, you will see a jump in collection.
You will see a jump in collections at some point, but right now there is an issue of the states waiting for their compensation from the month of August and the fear that it will be delayed even further. Will that put them in the kind of mindset where they may be wanting to increase at least some taxes, find an increase in revenue? Mr. Najib Shah, what's your take?
I think it's very important that we put things in perspective. You see, the entire purpose of GST is to capture value addition at every stage. The first question we need to answer is whether this value addition is indeed being captured in terms of the appropriate rate for each stage. My feeling, my sense is that it is not so. The rates are far too less right now. The RBI in its recent report has told that the weighted average in July 2017 was just under 15. Currently, we have brought the rates to just above 11, which means over the period of 2 years, we have reduced weighted average rates consistently and regularly. Apart from the obvious loss of revenue, it has really not spurred demand as we all expected it to. The economy is really not in good shape. The compensation cess commodities are entirely a different bunch of commodities. As Maithili pointed out, those are a small bunch of commodities which you have got. The elbow room available is very, very small. So if you're looking at a hike of rates for compensation, You're looking at very small commodities which are already at 28%, and they cannot go higher unless you bring in some commodities into the list of commodities on which you can charge a cess, which can therefore be used for compensating the states for the shortfall. We have little or no elbow room. So, I would think that we need to look at the rates very, very closely and not hesitate to hike up a few rates here and there, because we have reduced them far too much, not for economic reasons, and it has not paid any dividends at all. As the cess part of it is a different kettle of fish. We would need to look at whether we want to bring in commodities under the cess group, and then look at an appropriate cess.
Seeing comments there, and debate is open. If anyone has a response, please indicate. But Mr. Najib Shah, you're saying increase the rates a little bit here and there. Can you elaborate where is the room for here or for there? Because the government is very clear that what is seen widely as essential commodities will not be taxed at all or included in GST. And it would be a wildly unpopular move to increase the taxes, especially at a time like this.
But well, you have little or no choice. This is what I'm trying to tell you. Look, the purpose of GST is to capture value addition at every stage, giving you credit for these stages earlier. Now, the rates which we started off itself were equivalent rates of the existing central excise and service tax. Now, that's a weighted average of that was just under 15. We have brought it now to just above 11. So, we have dramatically reduced rates on a whole range of commodities, and you will agree with me, not very many of these reductions were for economic reasons. There were political reasons, and I know that very well. But the result of that has been a dramatic fall in revenue. Across the country, we have a fall in revenue, which is why the states need to have compensation. If the states were getting the adequate revenue, they would not need to have compensation. I can give you examples of any number of commodities. Look at gold. Precious commodities are all at a 3% slab. There's no justification for them to be at the 3% slab. Yes, an increase in rate may perhaps spur smuggling, but that's a call we need to take and tighten up our enforcement. Even now, like Prateek pointed out, we need to look at technology, we need to look at simplification, etc., and improve compliance. But at the end of the day, the government needs revenue, and we do not have revenue. I would think that there is a need to seriously look at the commodities where you can increase, and the whole host of commodities are there which can be increased, in my opinion, because we need to have revenue, and that will reduce the burden of compensation.
Absolutely. Prateek, you want to come in on that point? Mr. Najib Shah very convinced that there is really not much choice except to increase GST rates right now at a time when everyone's arguing for a reduction, not just in GST and personal income tax as well, to spur demand.
No, I mean, I have a slightly different view. I understand where he's coming from, but I still am not convinced that increasing the rate will lead to increase in revenue collections. And I have not seen that happening in the last 2 years when there has been a decrease. We have seen after the decrease, still the revenue collections have gone up and gone up substantially, right? I mean, if you look at different slabs, items which are exempt, you hardly have any scope to increase. Those are like basic food items and essential medicines and things like that. Unless you are willing to tax education and healthcare, which is a large sort of decision for the government to take, you don't have much. The only perhaps item that Mr. Shah is referring to is 18% to 28%, and those could include leather items and furniture and white goods and stuff like that. But bear in mind, and I take that point that perhaps in pre-GST environment the rate was higher than 18%, certainly not as high, it's 28 to my mind. But GST is a completely different ball game. I mean, world over, you see, even if you compare India with European Union, you'll hardly have any country which is more than 18-20% rate on an average. And of course, Singapore and Malaysia and several other countries are far lesser. I think broadening the tax base is definitely required, and therefore you need to sort of catch the tax evaders. Not a right time to look at tax rate changes. Every time the tax rate changes, industry has to sort of look at things. There are anti-profiteering which plays out. There are whole amount of changes that the company need to do. I think we stopped that practice of changing these rates frequently when the GST came in. Of course, GST Council has been kind enough to look at reduction. I don't think it's the right time. It might be counterproductive to increase the rates at this point in time, including the compensation cess, to my mind.
Okay, so then now let's look at what is working, what is not working with GST. We know that there are mixed views on this panel of whether rates should be increased or not, and how they will be taken. But Maithili, the basic issues still continue, isn't it? There has been a demand today to for the central government to look closely at input credit fraud, which already the government has got more than 11,500 crore rupees of input credit fraud. There are newer and more innovative ways of evasion being found every day, and the basic adage is that the lower the taxes, the less people will try to evade.
Well, yes, that is true. The lower the rate, the less people will try to evade. But in the case of GST, since it is a new tax, there are a lot of people who still want to try and game it as far as possible. So to that extent, I think technology would be a big enabler to try and stop this kind of input tax fraud, but the input credit fraud. But there is a limit to which the government can do it overnight. So the fact is that today, when the government is pressed hard for funds, it needs to do something. Things like cracking down on tax evasion will not give you a dramatic increase in the tax revenues. And as Najib said, the fact is that you do have absurd situations where gold and precious stones are charged at just about 2%. There is no reason whatsoever. If smuggling occurs as a consequence, the idea is to crack down on smuggling, not to keep the rate of GST so low. So I think there is a great deal of scope to relook at the rates, and since this is done by the GST Council, which is a truly federal body, whatever decision is taken finally will have the buy-in of all the state finance ministers as also of the union. So to that extent, I think we are very hopeful that we will reach a decision which takes care of both revenue concerns as well as looks at rates. And I agree with Prateek, you should not keep constantly changing rates. But at a time like this, when the economy is slowing down, the fact is you cannot really expect the GST revenues to look up unless you do something, if not very dramatic, at least make a beginning to ensure that many of the quirks in GST are addressed.
Well, but is the answer reducing the rates or increasing the rates? Prateek, what's your take on that? Is the answer to actually increase the GST rates at this point or reduce them? Reduce them further and hope that spurs demand?
I would, I think the answer to my mind is not reduce, not increase at this point in time. Just hold it for another 6-8 months, see how it goes. I don't think it's a good idea. What is government trying to do? There is a apparent slowdown. You have cut the income tax rates. Now, if you increase the GST rates, with the hope that you will collect more, demand is likely to sort of fall down further, and you may actually not collect even as much as you are doing right now, right? And as far as compensation is concerned, and that really bothers me. I mean, 2.5 years of GST. If all the states are getting compensated, what will happen after 5 years? This compensation cess mechanism was there for 5 years. Now, definitely, I mean, you have to look at a self-sustaining model for Indian taxation system, and today you don't have a self-sustaining model. Answer to my mind is not increasing the tax rate. Just hold it on by increasing the tax rate now. In fact, earlier, whenever there has been a slowdown, 2008, for example, and Mr. Najib Shah will bear me out, there have always been excise duty cuts, etc., on automobiles and things like that, in an attempt to revive the demand. And today we know that almost all the sectors, auto, real estate, most of the other sectors are really struggling. So this is really certainly not the time to increase the tax rates.
Let's talk about a very important point that Prateek brought up, Mr. Najib Shah, and I'd like your view on it, because from the last few days we've been hearing all the state FMs, talk about the compensations not coming in. Now, the Act envisioned the central government making good any losses if revenues fell below 14%. In a slowdown that's bound to happen, everyone's restricted. In fact, some very strong statements coming from state finance ministers, one of them saying, I'm embarrassed to come and ask for money, from the central government, etc. But doesn't it also point out to the fact that the system has not smoothened out even 2.5 years down the line?
you must bear in mind the fact that the compensation was to be given by a special cess on select commodities. Now, this bunch of commodities, which are all in the 28% bracket, has been steadily reduced. Now you have got literally 6 commodities in the 28% bracket on which compensation cess is to be raised to compensate for possible loss of all the states. Secondly, what has happened, and it's my considered view, that the compensation has made the states just a bit complacent in terms of not putting up that much more effort to ensure that revenues are collected in their respective states under the SGST. Now, the bigger the gap between the 14% growth on a base of 15-16, which has been promised, the more there's a burden on the center. And GST really is something where the states have to also share the burden along the center to the extent possible. Now, where is the center going to compensate and give them the money from? It does not have sufficient money to be given from the CGST and the IGST, which is already not possible for it to share from there. It has only to raise it from the compensation cess for which this entire act and enactment was done. So, in case that money is not there in the cess, then where are we going to get the money to compensate? It's a $1 million question really, which needs to be looked into and answered, which is why one is thinking in terms of an increase in rates so that the state's compensation requirement will reduce.
Yeah. You know, we're not talking about the political backdrop to this, but I think it's important because remember, a lot of the state finance ministers now very vocally demanding compensation, and of course all states will want it, are opposition, state finance ministers from opposition parties. And the fact is that the entire GST structure was based and is based on a kind of federal cooperation that we've rarely seen otherwise. If the money sort of stops flowing, will that glue also then come undone? Maithili, that's a really valid concern, isn't it?
Well, so far the GST Council decisions have all been taken by consensus, and in fact the Indian politicians have shown a great deal of maturity in addressing the concerns. An ideal solution to my mind, maybe a little idealistic completely, would be for the states to lower that demand of 14%, because when this 14% growth in revenue over the 15-16 base was promised, the economy was doing quite well. Since then things have changed very dramatically. So clearly that 14% in hindsight was a dramatic over-promise, if that could be, if you could coin a word like that. So if at the GST Council, the states could themselves lower that demand and say, look, we cannot possibly expect that revenues would grow at 14% at the time the economy is slowing down. Maybe we could perhaps arrive at a consensus where say 10% or 8% would suffice. Because as Najib and Pratik mentioned, what happens after 5 years? The states have to look sharp and set their own house in order. So maybe it is possible for the GST Council to say, let's lower that demand from 14%. Of course, it isn't there in the GST bill, Act, so it would require an amendment. But it's not, it need not necessarily be entirely a wild idea.
Pratik is smiling there. Pratik, you think it's feasible? Is any state going to accept the prospect of less money?
No, I'm glad that Maithili started saying that idealistic, and we don't live in idealistic world. I don't think it's possible, right? So, if at all, rate increase is the only option. The government says rate increase is the only option. I would prefer if rather than increasing the tax rates on select items, because always it's difficult to choose. You increase the tax slab itself. Make that 18% to 19%, or make that 18 to 20. But I mean, choosing out of bouquet of 200 items, saying these 50 out, these 30 or these 20 items deserve a rate increase, I think is a very, very difficult decision. There are pros and cons involved, and it's not good to kind of keep tinkering the tax rates. If you believe that 18% revenue neutral rate is not the right rate, make it 19, make it 20, but don't be selective in increasing the tax rates on a few commodities.
Well, increasing GST rates in the middle of a slowdown is going to be one tough act to pull off. At least it won't go down easily politically in this environment, but we'll have to wait and see what happens in that December 18th meeting and how the government can maintain this fine balance between revenues drying up and making sure that they don't dampen demand any further. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on the first big debate this evening on the India Development Debate.